Farewell, Miss Dubois. It appears duty calls.
Must it be this way?
The autumn of 1847 arrived in Bath with a peculiar intensity. The leaves turned golden with an almost defiant brilliance, as though nature itself refused to yield quietly to the approaching cold. It was during this season that Viscount Edmund Thorne found himself standing in the pump room, a glass of mineral water untouched in his hand, watching the assembly with the detached interest of a man who had seen too much of society and found it wanting. He was 32 years of age, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell with studied carelessness across his forehead. His grey eyes possessed a quality that unnerved most people, a penetrating directness that suggested he could see through pretense and politeness to the shallow ambitions beneath. The ladies of Bath whispered that he was handsome, certainly, but there was something forbidding in his manner, something that kept even the most determined mothers from pushing their daughters too forcefully into his path. Edmund had not come to Bath seeking company. He had come seeking solitude, though he would not have admitted this even to himself. London had grown tiresome with its endless rounds of obligation, its theatre of manners in which everyone performed roles they despised. Here, at least, the theatre was smaller, the performances less polished, and therefore somehow more honest in their dishonesty. "You appear to be studying the room as though it were a specimen under glass," came a voice beside him, light and faintly amused. Edmund turned to find his cousin, Robert Thorne, regarding him with knowing eyes. Robert was younger by 5 years, fairer in colouring, and possessed of an easy charm that Edmund had never managed to cultivate, nor particularly wished to. "I'm merely observing," Edmund replied, his tone suggesting that observation was a perfectly reasonable occupation for a gentleman at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. "You are judging," Robert corrected, though without censure. "You always are. It is your particular talent and your particular curse." Edmund did not deny this. There was little point in denying what was manifestly true. Instead, he took a small sip of the water, grimaced at its mineral taste, and set the glass aside on a nearby table. "Has anything of interest occurred since I arrived last week?" he asked, more from politeness than genuine curiosity. Robert's eyes lit with something that might have been mischief. "That depends entirely upon what you consider interesting. There has been the usual assembly of invalids seeking cures, matrons seeking husbands for their daughters, and gentlemen seeking escape from their wives. However," he paused. "Dramatically, there is one new arrival who has caused rather a stir. I cannot imagine why you believe this would interest me. Because she is precisely the sort of person you claim not to notice, which means you will notice her immediately and spend considerable energy pretending you have not." Edmund raised an eyebrow, a gesture he had perfected over years of expressing skepticism without the vulgarity of actual speech. "You speak in riddles this morning." "Miss Catherine Ashworth," Robert said simply. "She arrived a fortnight ago with her aunt, Mrs. Daventry, 24 years of age, unmarried, and in possession of a modest fortune left to her by her father, who was a naval captain of some distinction. She is—" he searched for the right word. "Unusual." "Unusual in what respect?" "She speaks her mind rather more directly than is considered proper. She reads philosophy. She was observed yesterday walking along the river alone, quite alone, mind you, with a book under her arm, and—" When Lady Pemberton expressed shock at such impropriety, Miss Ashworth apparently replied that she found the company of ideas more stimulating than the company of gossip. Despite himself, Edmund felt a flicker of interest, quickly suppressed. "She sounds insufferable." "She sounds intelligent," Robert countered, which, I grant you, is often considered the same thing in polite society. Before Edmund could respond, there was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the kind that occurs when someone enters who possesses either great beauty or great scandal. Edmund found himself turning, along with most of the other occupants of the pump room, toward the entrance. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. This was Edmund's first thought, delivered with the clinical precision he applied to all his observations. Her features were too strong, her colouring too vivid. She wore a simple morning dress of deep blue that suggested either excellent taste or complete indifference to fashion. Edmund suspected the latter. Her dark hair was arranged simply, without the elaborate curls and ornaments favoured by most young ladies. She moved with a directness of purpose that suggested she had come here for the waters rather than the society. But it was her eyes that arrested him. Even from across the room, Edmund could see their unusual color, a green so dark it appeared almost black in certain lights, and they were not cast downward in the modest manner expected of young ladies. They surveyed the room with frank interest, assessing and cataloguing with the same detachment Edmund himself employed. For one brief, disorienting moment, their gazes met across the crowded room. Edmund felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in so many years that he barely recognized it. It was not attraction, precisely, or rather, it was not merely attraction. It was recognition. The uncomfortable recognition that here was someone who might actually see him. Not the title or the fortune or the carefully cultivated facade, but the man beneath. He looked away first, an act that cost him more than he cared to admit. "Shall I introduce you?" Robert asked, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested he had observed everything. "That will not be necessary." "Edmund?" "I said it will not be necessary." Edmund's tone carried a note of finality that even Robert knew better than to challenge. He watched from the periphery of his vision as Miss Ashworth collected her water and moved to stand near the windows where morning light fell across her face with painterly precision. She was alone, her aunt apparently occupied elsewhere, and she seemed entirely comfortable with this state. She stood gazing out at the autumn gardens with an expression of contemplation that suggested her thoughts were far away from Bath and its social intricacies. The lesson here is one we often forget. Sometimes we recognize in others the very qualities we have. Buried in ourselves, honesty, directness, the courage to stand alone, and sometimes that recognition terrifies us more than anything else could. Edmund found himself unable to look away, even as he despised this weakness in himself. He had spent years perfecting the art of indifference, of moving through the world without attachment or vulnerability. It was safer this way, cleaner, less prone to the kinds of disappointments that had once nearly destroyed him. A gentleman approached Miss Ashworth. Young Hartley, Edmund noted with distaste, a shallow creature known more for his father's fortune than any quality of his own. Hartley bowed with exaggerated courtesy and said something that caused Miss Ashworth to turn toward him with polite attention. She replied. Edmund was too far away to hear the words, and Hartley laughed too loudly, the way men do when they wish others to think them witty. Edmund felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. "You are staring," Robert observed quietly. "I am doing nothing of the sort." "Of course not, forgive me. You are merely looking with great intensity in a direction that happens to include Miss Ashworth." Edmund turned to his cousin with an expression that would have silenced most men. "Your wit grows tiresome, Robert." "My wit remains constant. Your sensitivity to it is what has changed." Before Edmund could deliver the cutting reply this deserved, Miss Ashworth moved away from young Hartley, rather abruptly, Edmund noted with satisfaction, and began walking in their direction. She was not walking toward them precisely, but rather toward the exit, which unfortunately required passing quite close to where they stood. As she approached, Edmund found himself standing straighter, his hands clasping behind his back in an unconscious gesture of military bearing. He fixed his gaze on a point somewhere above her head, determined not to meet her eyes again. "Good morning," Robert said pleasantly as she drew near, executing a slight bow. "Miss..." Ashworth paused, turning to regard them with that same frank assessment. "Good morning," she replied. Her voice was lower than Edmund had expected, with a slight roughness that suggested she spoke from conviction rather than mere politeness. "Allow me to introduce my cousin, Viscount Thorne," Robert continued, apparently determined to torture Edmund. "Edmund, this is Miss Catherine Ashworth." Edmund had no choice but to bow, though he kept the gesture minimal. "Miss Ashworth." "My lord." She inclined her head with perfect propriety, but there was something in her eyes, amusement perhaps or challenge, that suggested she found the formalities as absurd as he secretly did. "I trust you are finding Bath agreeable?" Edmund asked, because silence would have been even more awkward than this hollow pleasantry. "I am finding it exactly as I expected," she replied, which was not precisely an answer at all. "And what, may I ask, did you expect?" Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something more interesting than politeness. "I expected a great deal of invalids seeking miracle cures, a great deal of society seeking distraction from their lives, and a great deal of water that tastes vaguely of minerals and disappointment. Thus far, my expectations have been met with remarkable precision. Edmund felt something dangerous stirring inside him, the beginning of a smile, which he suppressed ruthlessly. You have a rather cynical view of Bath's offerings. I have a realistic view, she corrected, which is often mistaken for cynicism by those who prefer comfortable illusions. The words were delivered without particular heat, as simple observations rather than challenges, which somehow made them more provocative. Edmund found himself caught between irritation and unwilling admiration. "And do you count yourself among those who prefer reality to illusion?" he asked, aware that his tone had sharpened despite his intention to remain indifferent. "I count myself among those who find reality more interesting than any illusion could be," she replied, meeting his gaze with disconcerting steadiness. "Though I acknowledge that makes me rather unusual in polite society." "Unusual," Edmund repeated, with just enough emphasis to suggest that he might substitute a different word. Her eyes flashed. Definitely amusement now. "I believe that is the word most commonly employed when people wish to be polite about qualities they find unsettling. I have also been called forthright, independent, and, on one memorable occasion, dangerously unorthodox." "And are you?" Edmund asked, the question escaping before he could prevent it. "Dangerously unorthodox? That depends entirely upon what one considers dangerous," she said softly. Then, before he could formulate a response to this cryptic statement, she inclined her head once more. "Gentlemen, I must take my leave. My aunt will be expecting me." She walked away without looking back, leaving Edmund staring after her, with an expression that would have alarmed him had he been capable of seeing his own face. "Well," Robert said after a long moment, "that was fascinating." "That was nothing," Edmund replied too quickly. "Of course it was nothing, which is why you look as though you have just been struck by lightning." Edmund turned to his cousin with cold precision. "I look nothing of the sort. Edmund, I have known you since we were boys. I have seen you face down creditors, hostile peers, and that formidable aunt of ours without so much as a flicker of expression. Just now, in the space of 3 minutes, I watched approximately 17 different emotions cross your face. You exaggerate absurdly. I underestimate, if anything." Robert's expression softened into something approaching concern. "She unsettles you. Why?" Edmund wanted to deny it. He wanted to dismiss the entire encounter as meaningless, to return to his rooms and forget that Miss Catherine Ashworth existed. But he had never been particularly skilled at lying to himself, and he found he could not begin now. "I do not know," he admitted finally, the words costing him considerably. "And that, perhaps, is precisely what unsettles me." They left the pump room shortly thereafter, walking out into the autumn morning with its sharp, clean air. Edmund told himself he was relieved to be away from the close atmosphere, the chattering crowds, the relentless performance of society. He told himself that Miss Ashworth had been nothing more than a brief distraction, a momentary aberration in his otherwise well-ordered existence. But as they walked along Milsom Street, past shop windows displaying their autumn wares, Edmund found his thoughts returning again and again to green eyes and a voice that spoke of reality rather than illusion. He found himself remembering the way she had stood alone by the windows, completely comfortable in her solitude. He found himself wondering what she had been thinking as she gazed out at the gardens, what philosophical volume she had been reading by the river, what experiences had taught her to value reality over comfortable deception. He found himself, quite against his will and better judgment, wanting to know her. And that, Edmund reflected with grim recognition, was precisely the kind of wanting that had once destroyed him completely. He would not allow it to happen again. He would avoid Miss Catherine Ashworth with the same disciplined determination he applied to all dangerous things. He would not seek her out, would not maneuver for introductions, would not allow himself to wonder about the woman behind those remarkable eyes. It was a sensible resolution, a necessary one, and Edmund maintained it with perfect success for nearly 3 entire days. The library at the assembly rooms was not well attended on Thursday afternoons. Most of Bath's visitors preferred the more public spaces, the pump room with its constant flow of gossip, the promenades where one could see and be seen, the shops along Milsom Street where fortunes were spent on frivolities disguised as necessities. The library, with its tall windows and rows of leather-bound volumes, attracted only those souls who genuinely sought the company of ideas rather than the performance of intellectual interest. Edmund had discovered this sanctuary on his second day in Bath and had been returning regularly ever since, finding in the quiet rustle of pages and the scent of old leather something approaching peace. He came not because he particularly needed to read. His own library at Thornfield Hall was extensive, but because here, surrounded by books, he was not required to be Viscount Thorn. He could simply be a man who read. He was deep in a volume of Herodotus, considering the Greek historian's observations on the nature of empire and decline, when he became aware of another presence in the room. He did not look up immediately. To do so would have been to acknowledge the intrusion. But something in the quality of the silence had changed. The air itself seemed to have gained weight, texture, significance. When he finally raised his eyes from the page, he found Miss Catherine Ashworth standing near one of the far bookcases, her fingers trailing along the spines with the careful attention of someone who treated books as treasures rather than decorations. She had not seen him. Edmund was certain of this, because her expression held a quality of unguarded contemplation that would have vanished had she known herself observed. She wore the same simple style of dress he had noted before, grey today, with only a touch of embroidery at the collar, and her hair was arranged with the same lack of artifice. She appeared entirely absorbed in her examination of the available volumes, pausing occasionally to pull one from the shelf, examine its title and contents, then replace it with care. Edmund knew he should make his presence known. To remain silent while observing her was to commit a breach of propriety that bordered on the ungentlemanly, and yet he found himself hesitating, unwilling to break whatever spell had allowed him this glimpse of her when she believed herself alone. She selected a volume finally, Locke's essay concerning human understanding, Edmund noted, and moved toward one of the reading chairs arranged near the windows. Only then, as she turned, did she become aware of him sitting in the corner with his Herodotus. He watched several expressions move across her face in rapid succession, surprise followed by something that might have been pleasure, quickly suppressed into polite neutrality. "Lord Thorn," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "I apologize. I did not realize anyone else was here." Edmund rose because failing to do so would have been actively rude. "The fault is mine, Miss Ashworth. I should have made my presence known when you entered." "Should you have?" She regarded him with genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "I rather think we were both entitled to assume ourselves alone in a library on a Thursday afternoon. It is not precisely a popular destination." "No," he agreed, "it is not." They stood there, the length of the room between them, engaged in a silence that was not quite comfortable but not entirely uncomfortable either. Edmund found himself acutely aware of details he had no business noticing. The way afternoon light caught in her dark hair, turning it faintly auburn at the edges. The way she held the Locke volume with both hands as though it were something precious. The way her eyes remained steady on his face, neither bold nor modest, simply present. "Herodotus," she observed, nodding toward the book he still held. "Are you studying ancient Greece, or are you drawn to his observations on human nature?" Edmund glanced down at the volume in his hand, surprised that she had identified it from across the room. "The latter," he admitted, "though I confess his prose. Style has aged rather less gracefully than his insights. That is the curse of being translated from ancient Greek by earnest Victorian scholars," she said, moving a few steps closer. "Not presumptuous, but enough to close the distance for comfortable conversation. They seem to believe that adding 3 subordinate clauses to every sentence somehow honors the original. I suspect Herodotus himself would have written with rather more directness." "You read ancient Greek?" Edmund asked, unable to keep a note of surprise from his voice. Her lips curved in what was definitely amusement now. "My father believed that a mind was a mind, regardless of whether it happened to belong to a daughter rather than a son. He taught me Greek and Latin both, along with mathematics, natural philosophy, and several other subjects generally considered unsuitable for young ladies." She paused, her expression becoming more guarded. "I understand this makes me something of an oddity. It makes you educated," Edmund replied, and was startled by the forcefulness of his own tone, which should not be confused with oddity, though I acknowledge that society often makes precisely that confusion. She studied him for a long moment, as though reassessing some earlier conclusion. That is an unexpectedly charitable view from a man who appeared to find me quite unsettling when we met in the pump room. Edmund felt heat rising along his neck, an adolescent response he thought himself long past. I did not find. You unsettling? Of course not. You merely stood with the rigidity of a soldier facing artillery fire and spoke to me as though I were a particularly dangerous form of munitions. Despite himself, Edmund felt the corners of his mouth twitch. That is a considerable exaggeration. Is it? She tilted her head, considering him with those remarkable eyes. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps it was only moderate artillery fire. The absurdity of this exchange struck Edmund with unexpected force. Here, he stood, in a library in Bath, discussing ancient Greeks and military metaphors with a woman who read philosophy for pleasure and seemed entirely unintimidated by his title or his carefully cultivated reserve. It was, he realized, the most genuine conversation he had experienced in months, possibly years, and that realization frightened him considerably more than he cared to admit. We often build walls around ourselves not to keep others out, but to keep our own vulnerability safely contained. Yet those same walls become our prisons, and we spend our lives both guarding them and longing for someone brave enough to scale them. May I ask, Edmund said carefully, what draws you to Locke? It is not the sort of volume most young ladies select for afternoon reading. Most young ladies are not invited to select such volumes, she corrected. They are steered toward novels of appropriate sentiment and moral instruction. But to answer your question, I am interested in Locke's discussion of identity and consciousness, the question of what makes us ourselves from one moment to the next, a question he never entirely answers. No, she agreed, but the attempting is valuable nonetheless. Sometimes the questions matter more than the answers. Edmund found himself moving closer without conscious decision, drawn by the rare pleasure of intellectual engagement with someone who thought rather than merely performed thinking. That is a dangerously philosophical position, Miss Ashworth. Is it dangerous to suggest that inquiry itself has value, regardless of conclusion? It is dangerous to suggest that questions matter more than answers. Society tends to prefer certainty, even false certainty, to the discomfort of genuine uncertainty. Then society is built on rather shaky foundations, she observed, though I suspect you already know this. Edmund felt something shift in his chest again, that same unsettling sensation he had experienced in the pump room. Recognition, the dangerous acknowledgement that here was someone who might actually understand the doubts he kept carefully hidden beneath layers of aristocratic certainty. He should have left then, should have made some polite excuse, and retreated to the safety of his lodgings. Instead, he heard himself say, "Would you object if I remained? I find I am not yet finished with Herodotus, and I confess I prefer reading in company, provided the company is sufficiently quiet." She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "I would not object at all, Lord Thorn. I too prefer reading in company, though I must warn you that I occasionally make notes in margins, which some consider a form of sacrilege. Only by those who do not actually read their books." They settled into chairs near the windows, at angles that allowed conversation but did not demand it. Edmund returned to his Herodotus, though he found his attention wandering from ancient Persians to the woman across from him, who read with complete absorption, occasionally pausing to make a note in a small journal she had produced from her reticule. The afternoon sun moved across the floor in bars of gold and shadow. Someone coughed discreetly in a distant corner of the building. A church bell chimed the hour somewhere in Bath's honeyed stone streets, and Edmund found himself experiencing something he had not felt in 7 years: contentment. Not the brittle satisfaction of a life well ordered, not the grim pleasure of obligations met, but genuine contentment. The simple peace of being in the presence of someone who required nothing from him except his authentic self. It was precisely this contentment that terrified him. 7 years ago, Edmund had allowed himself to feel such things. 7 years ago, he had permitted hope and happiness and all the other dangerous emotions that made men vulnerable. 7 years ago, he had loved someone with the totality that only the young and foolish could manage. And 7 years ago, that love had been returned with betrayal so complete, so devastating, that it had reshaped the very architecture of his soul. Her name had been Elizabeth, Miss Elizabeth Fairfax, daughter of a baron, beautiful in the conventional way that made men foolish. Edmund had been 25, newly come into his title after his father's death, still naive enough to believe that honest feeling would be honestly returned. They had been engaged for 6 months, 6 months during which Edmund had imagined a future filled with companionship and shared purpose. 6 months during which he had allowed himself to be vulnerable in ways he had never been before or since. And then, 3 weeks before the wedding, he had discovered her in the garden at Thornfield with Lord Carmichael, locked in an embrace that left no room for misunderstanding. The betrayal itself had been devastating enough, but it was what came after that had truly destroyed something essential in Edmund's nature. Because Elizabeth had not apologized, had not begged forgiveness or claimed temporary madness. Instead, she had laughed, actually laughed, and told him that she had never loved him, had only accepted his proposal because a viscountcy was respectable, even if the man holding it was impossibly dull. "You are so serious, Edmund," she had said, her beautiful face twisted with contempt. "So earnest and honorable and boring. Did you really think I could spend a lifetime with someone who treats everything, absolutely everything, as though it were a matter of grave moral importance?" He had ended the engagement immediately, of course, and Elizabeth had married Lord Carmichael 3 months later, apparently with no regret whatsoever. Edmund had told himself he was recovered. He had returned to society, had fulfilled his obligations, had continued his life with the same precision and discipline he applied to all things. But something inside him had calcified, had hardened into an inflexible commitment to never again allow anyone close enough to wound him so deeply. And now, sitting in a library in Bath with autumn light streaming through the windows, he felt that calcification beginning to crack. Miss Ashworth looked up from her book, caught his gaze and smiled. A small private smile that suggested she too was experiencing something unexpected in this quiet room. Edmund did not smile back. Could not, because to smile would be to acknowledge the feelings stirring inside him, and acknowledgement would make them real, and reality would make him vulnerable again. So instead he returned his attention to his Herodotus, to ancient empires and their inevitable decline, and told himself that he was simply being sensible. But he remained in the library for 3 more hours, long past when he might reasonably have finished his reading, because Miss Catherine Ashworth remained, and Edmund found that he could not quite bring himself to leave. The upper assembly rooms on Tuesday evening represented everything Edmund typically despised about Bath society: the forced gaiety, the elaborate dress concealing shallow purposes, the eternal dance of courtship and commerce disguised as entertainment. Yet here he stood, having dressed with unusual care, though he would have denied this strenuously, watching the dancers move through their practiced patterns while pretending he was not searching the crowd for one particular face. He had not seen Miss Ashworth since Thursday in the library. This was by design, or so he told himself. He had deliberately avoided the pump room during the hours she typically visited, had changed his walking routes to minimize any chance encounter, had even gone so far as to read his Herodotus at his lodgings rather than return to the library where she might appear. This avoidance was sensible, necessary, an exercise in self-preservation. Edmund repeated this to himself with the regularity of prayer, as though repetition might transmute desire into indifference. It had not worked. "You are scowling at the musicians," Robert observed, appearing beside him with the uncanny timing that characterized all cousins who knew one too well. "What offense have they committed beyond the usual massacre of Mozart?" "I am not scowling. You are absolutely scowling. Your expression suggests they have personally wronged your entire family across multiple generations." Edmund forced his features into something approaching neutrality. "I am merely observing. You are lurking in corners like a Gothic villain and radiating disapproval so intensely that people are giving you a rather wide berth." Robert paused, then added with studied casualness, "She is here, you know." Edmund did not need to ask whom his cousin meant. Nevertheless, he maintained his pretense of indifference. "I have no idea what you are talking about." "Of course not. That is why you have been staring at the entrance for the past 20 minutes, with the intensity of someone awaiting the second coming." Before Edmund could deliver the cutting response this deserved, the quality of sound in the room shifted subtly. Not silence precisely, but that peculiar focused attention that signaled the arrival of someone interesting. Edmund found his gaze drawn to the entrance despite himself. Miss Ashworth stood in the doorway beside her aunt, Mrs. Daventry, surveying the assembly with the same frank assessment Edmund had noted at their first encounter. She wore evening dress tonight, a gown of deep emerald that brought out the unusual green of her eyes, but maintained her characteristic simplicity of style. Where other ladies adorned themselves with elaborate jewelry and ornament, she wore only a simple gold locket at her throat. She was, Edmund was forced to acknowledge, striking. Not beautiful in the vapid manner of Elizabeth Fairfax, but striking in the way that Greek statuary was striking. Strong lines, classical proportions, an impression of intelligence that elevated mere prettiness into something more compelling, and Edmund was not the only man who noticed. He watched with growing tension as young Hartley approached her almost immediately, bowing with his usual excessive courtesy. Miss Ashworth smiled politely, the social smile Edmund had learned to distinguish from her genuine one, and accepted his invitation to dance. "You are going to shatter that glass if you grip it any tighter," Robert murmured. Edmund looked down to discover he was indeed holding his champagne glass with sufficient force to risk breakage. He loosened his grip deliberately, carefully, as though this small act of control could somehow contain the entirely inappropriate emotions churning through his chest. "I have no interest whatsoever in Miss Ashworth's dancing partners," he said, aware even as he spoke that the statement was transparently false. "Of course not. That is why you are tracking her movements across the floor with the focus of a hawk. Watching a field mouse." Edmund said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not reveal precisely how much Miss Ashworth had unsettled his carefully maintained equilibrium. They danced. Edmund watched, because he could not quite manage not to watch, as Hartley guided her through the figures with practiced ease. The young man was smiling too broadly, leaning too close, clearly attempting charm through sheer force of enthusiasm, and Miss Ashworth was being polite. Nothing more than polite, Edmund told himself. Her smile never reached her eyes. Her responses appeared measured rather than warm, and twice Edmund saw her create additional distance when Hartley attempted to close it. This observation should have provided satisfaction. Instead, it merely intensified the dark feeling coiling in his chest. Pride often disguises itself as principle. We tell ourselves we are being sensible, maintaining appropriate distance, acting with proper decorum, when in truth, we are simply afraid to risk wanting something we might not be allowed to have. The dance ended. Hartley escorted Miss Ashworth from the floor, bowing again with that same excessive courtesy. Edmund watched as she curtsied in return, watched as she moved away toward where her aunt sat with the other matrons, watched as— "Thorne! Good to see you, old man." Edmund turned to find Lord Ambrose approaching, accompanied by a younger man Edmund did not recognize. Ambrose was near 40, florid-faced, possessed of more fortune than taste and more confidence than either. Edmund had never particularly liked him, but they maintained the shallow cordiality that characterized most aristocratic acquaintance. "Ambrose," Edmund acknowledged with minimal warmth. "Allow me to introduce my nephew, Mr. Philip Whitmore," Ambrose continued, apparently impervious to Edmund's tone. "Just arrived from London. Philip, this is Viscount Thorne, one of Bath's more distinguished visitors." Whitmore was perhaps 28, fair-haired, pleasant-featured, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never experienced significant disappointment. He bowed properly and said all the correct things, and Edmund disliked him immediately, for no reason he could articulate. "My uncle tells me you have been in Bath several weeks now," Whitmore said pleasantly. "Are you finding the waters beneficial?" "I am not here for the waters." "Ah, then you are here for the society?" "I am here," Edmund said with deliberate emphasis, "because London became tiresome." Whitmore laughed, apparently choosing to interpret this rudeness as humor. "I quite understand. The season can be exhausting. Though I must say, Bath seems to offer its own particular charms." His gaze moved across the room, stopping precisely where Edmund had known it would stop. "That young lady in the emerald gown, for instance. Do you know who she is?" Edmund felt his jaw tighten involuntarily. "Miss Catherine Ashworth." "Ashworth," Whitmore repeated thoughtfully. "I do not believe I am acquainted with the family. Her father was Captain James Ashworth, Robert supplied helpfully, too helpfully in Edmund's opinion. Naval service. Distinguished himself in several engagements. Left his daughter comfortably situated, though not extravagantly so. Interesting, Whitmore said, still watching Miss Ashworth across the room. She has rather an unusual quality, does she not? Not the standard Bath Assembly beauty. No, Edmund agreed. Tightly. She is not standard in any respect. Whitmore glanced at him sharply, clearly catching something in Edmund's tone. Then he smiled, a knowing, competitive smile that Edmund recognized with sinking certainty. Well then, perhaps I should seek an introduction. Ambrose, you know everyone. Would you be so good? Edmund watched, powerless to prevent it without revealing precisely what he wished to conceal, as Ambrose led his nephew across the room toward where Miss Ashworth stood conversing. With her aunt. This is going to be interesting, Robert murmured. I cannot imagine why. Edmund, you are many things, but a skilled liar is not among them. You are clearly— I am clearly nothing, Edmund interrupted. Miss Ashworth is free to accept or refuse whatever introductions she chooses. It is of no concern to me whatsoever. The words sounded unconvincing even to his own ears. He watched as Ambrose made the introductions, watched as Whitmore bowed with practiced grace, watched as— Miss Ashworth regarded the newcomer with polite interest. They spoke for several minutes. Edmund was too far away to hear the conversation, though he found himself straining to catch even fragments. Then Whitmore extended his hand, clearly inviting her to dance. She hesitated. Edmund saw it clearly, that momentary pause before acceptance, but then she smiled, the polite social smile again, not the genuine one, and placed her hand in Whitmore's. Edmund watched them take their positions for the next. Dance. He watched Whitmore lean close to say something that made Miss Ashworth laugh, a real laugh this time, reaching her eyes. He watched them move through the figures with a coordination that suggested Whitmore was a significantly more skilled dancer than young Hartley had been, and he felt something dark and savage rise in his chest, something he barely recognized as jealousy, because he had not allowed himself to feel such things in 7 years. He should have left, should have departed the assembly with his dignity intact, returned to his lodgings, reminded himself of all the excellent reasons why Miss Catherine Ashworth represented precisely the kind of danger he had spent years learning to avoid. Instead, he found himself moving toward the dance floor, circling its perimeter with studied casualness, positioning himself where he might, quite accidentally of course, intercept Miss Ashworth when the dance concluded. The music ended. Couples separated, curtsied and bowed. Began. Moving away from the floor. Edmund timed his approach with the precision he applied to all tactical maneuvers, arriving precisely as Whitmore was escorting Miss Ashworth back toward her aunt. Miss Ashworth, he said, his voice carrying more command than he had intended, I wonder if you might honor me with the next dance. She stopped, turned to face him with surprise evident in her expression. Behind her, Whitmore's pleasant features arranged themselves into something approaching displeasure. Lord Thorn, she said slowly, I confess I did not expect, that is, I had not thought. You appeared to enjoy dancing in the library on Thursday, Edmund continued, aware that his words made little sense but unable to stop himself. I thought perhaps you might enjoy the activity with actual music accompanying it. A smile ghosted across her lips, the genuine one finally. We were not dancing in the library, my lord. We were reading. Were we? I must have been confused by all the Mozart. Now, she was definitely amused, though attempting to conceal it. There was no Mozart in the library. No? Then perhaps this evening we might correct that oversight. Whitmore cleared his throat pointedly. I was just about to request the next dance myself. Yes, Miss Ashworth said, addressing Edmund rather than Whitmore. I would be delighted to dance with you, Lord Thorn. She placed her hand in his, and Edmund felt the contact like electricity through his entire body. He led her onto the floor. Without looking back at Whitmore, without acknowledging Robert's knowing expression from across the room, without allowing himself to think about what he was doing, or why. The music began, a waltz, which meant they would be closer than the country dances had required. Edmund placed his hand at Miss Ashworth's waist, felt her hand rest on his shoulder, and was suddenly acutely aware that this was a mistake. Not because the proximity was improper, it was perfectly acceptable within the rules of the Waltz, but because he could smell her perfume now, something subtle and green like spring gardens, and feel the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her gloves, and see the exact color of her eyes this close, green with flecks of gold that caught the candlelight. "You are not usually one for dancing, Lord Thorne," she observed as they began to move through the steps. "Your cousin told me you have refused at least a dozen invitations since arriving in Bath. Robert talks too much. He is concerned about you. He has no cause for concern, does he not?" She studied his face with that disconcerting directness. "You stand in corners, radiating disapproval. You avoid society whenever possible. You read Greek historians as though searching them for solutions to personal problems. These are not typically the behaviors of a contented man." Edmund felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the physical proximity. "Perhaps I simply prefer solitude to empty society." "I understand that preference well," she said quietly. "But there is a difference between choosing solitude and using it as armor against genuine connection." The words struck too close to truths Edmund had spent years avoiding. He found himself responding with more heat than he intended. "You presume to know a great deal about me based on very limited acquaintance. I presume nothing. I simply observe what you show me, and what you are trying very hard not to show." They moved through several turns in silence. Edmund was aware of other dancers, other conversations, the music swelling around them, but all of it seemed distant, unimportant compared to the woman in his arms who saw through his carefully constructed defenses with alarming ease. "Mr. Whitmore seems charming," he said finally, attempting to change the subject in a direction that immediately revealed exactly what he had been thinking about. Miss Ashworth's lips curved. "He is pleasant enough. He appeared quite taken with you." "Did he? I had not particularly noticed. He requested a dance within minutes of introduction, as did young Mr. Hartley earlier this evening, as did several other gentlemen whose names I have already forgotten." She paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, "As did you, Lord Thorne, despite having avoided me carefully for 5 days." Edmund felt heat rising along his collar. "I have not been avoiding you." "Of course not. You have simply coincidentally altered your entire routine to ensure we never encounter one another." "That is absurd." "Is it? Then why did you suddenly appear this evening after carefully staying away? Why did you practically command me to dance with you, despite having refused every other invitation?" She met his gaze steadily. "Why are you holding me rather more tightly than the waltz strictly requires?" Edmund realized with shock that she was right. His hand had tightened at her waist, drawing her incrementally closer than propriety dictated. He loosened his grip immediately, though the loss of contact felt like deprivation. "Forgive me," he said stiffly. I did not say I objected." Her voice was soft now, almost gentle. "I merely wondered if you were aware of it." The music swelled toward its conclusion. Edmund found himself wishing the dance would continue indefinitely, that he could remain in this moment where she was close and real, and looking at him with something that might have been understanding. But the music ended, as music always did. They separated, bowed and curtsied with proper formality. Edmund offered his arm to escort her back to her aunt, felt her hand rest lightly on his sleeve, and experienced a longing so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you for the dance, Lord Thorne," she said as they reached Mrs. Daventry. "The pleasure was mine, Miss Ashworth." He bowed again and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Lord Thorne?" He turned back. "Yes? The library on Thursday afternoons is quite peaceful." She smiled, the genuine smile that transformed her face. "Should you find yourself there, I would not object to quiet company." Before he could respond, she had turned away to attend to her aunt, leaving Edmund standing in the middle of the assembly room with something dangerously close to hope rising in his chest. He left immediately after, not trusting himself to remain without seeking her out again. As he walked through Bath's lamplit streets toward his lodgings, he tried to summon all his careful reasons for maintaining distance. He tried to remember Elizabeth's laugh, the devastating discovery of her betrayal, the lesson he had learned about the dangers of vulnerability. But all he could think about was green eyes flecked with gold, and a voice that offered quiet company in libraries on Thursday afternoons. And Edmund, who prided himself on his strength and discipline, felt his carefully maintained defenses crumbling like ancient walls against a rising tide. Thursday. Arrived with the slow inevitability of consequence. Edmund woke early, attempted to read, found himself unable to concentrate, walked aimlessly through Bath streets until the appropriate hour, and finally stood outside the Assembly Room's library, with his heart beating too rapidly for a man of 32. This was absurd. He was being absurd. He was a viscount, a man of property and position, someone accustomed to managing estates and tenants and complex financial matters with efficiency and precision. The prospect of seeing Miss Catherine Ashworth in a library should not reduce him to this state of adolescent uncertainty. And yet, here he stood, smoothing his coat unnecessarily, checking his cravat, feeling for all the world like a young man about to call on his first love. He pushed open the door with more force than strictly necessary. The library was empty. Edmund felt disappointment settle over him like fog, cold and pervasive. She had not meant the invitation, or she had changed her mind, or he had misunderstood entirely, projected meaning onto words that had been nothing more than casual politeness. "You are early." He spun to find Miss Ashworth emerging from between the far bookcases, a volume already in hand, her expression caught between surprise and pleasure. That is," Edmund forced himself to stop stammering like a schoolboy. "I found myself at liberty earlier than anticipated." "I see." She moved toward the reading chairs they had occupied the previous week, settling into one with unconscious grace. "And did you bring your Herodotus, or have you exhausted his insights on human nature?" "I brought Thucydides instead, his Peloponnesian War, somewhat less philosophical, rather more pragmatic." "Ah, yes. History as it actually occurred rather than history as filtered through reflection and interpretation." She smiled. "Though one might argue that all history is interpretation, regardless of the historian's claims to objectivity. And just like that, Edmund felt the tension drain from his shoulders. This was why he had come, he told himself, not because of those green eyes or that smile, but because here was someone who could discuss Greek historians on Thursday afternoons without pretense or performance. He settled into the chair across from her, opened his Thucydides, and attempted to read. He lasted approximately 10 minutes before giving up entirely. "You are staring at the same page rather intently," Miss Ashworth observed without looking up from her own book. "Either Thucydides has written something of extraordinary density, or you are not actually reading." Edmund closed the volume. "What are you reading?" "Still Locke. I am finding his arguments increasingly frustrating, which generally means I am learning something despite myself." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Why are you here, Lord Thorn?" The question was delivered without accusation, simple curiosity mixed with something that might have been hope. Edmund found himself responding with more honesty than he had intended. "Because I find that I'm rather tired of pretending I do not wish to be here." Her expression softened. "That must be exhausting, all that pretending." "It is." "Then why do it?" "Because vulnerability led to devastation. Because caring meant risk. Because 7 years ago he had allowed himself to hope and been destroyed for it. Because the world was full of Elizabeth Fairfaxes who would use honest feeling as a weapon against those foolish enough to offer it." But he could not say any of this aloud. Instead he asked, "Why did you invite me?" "Because I find that I am rather tired of pretending I have not noticed your absence." She set down her lock with deliberate care. "And because I believe we might actually enjoy one another's company, if we could both stop performing our respective roles long enough to discover what lies beneath them." "And what role am I performing?" "The distant aristocrat who has been disappointed by life and therefore maintains careful distance from all potential sources of further disappointment." She paused. "It is quite an elaborate performance. You must be exhausted." Edmund felt something between amusement and alarm. "You presume a great deal." "I observe accurately. There is a difference." She leaned forward slightly. "I am 26 years old, Lord Thorn. I have spent those years being told in various ways that my intelligence makes me unsuitable, that my directness is unladylike, that my interests are inappropriate, that I should soften myself into something more acceptable to society's expectations. And I have discovered that such softening would require surrendering precisely those qualities that make me who I am. That is a brave choice. It is the only choice I can live with, but it is also a lonely one." Her eyes held his with uncomfortable intensity. "I think perhaps you have made a similar choice, though for different reasons. And I think perhaps we might be less lonely if we stopped maintaining quite such careful distance from those who might actually understand." The words landed with devastating accuracy. Edmund felt the last of his defensive walls trembling, felt the truth of her observation resonating through his chest like struck bronze, and felt fear rising in response. "Miss Ashworth, Catherine," she interrupted gently, "when we are here, in this library, might we dispense with the formalities? Might we simply be Edmund and Catherine, two people who read philosophy on Thursday afternoons? That would be highly irregular." "Yes," she agreed. "It would be. Does that trouble you?" It should have troubled him. It violated every rule of propriety, every careful boundary he had constructed. And yet sitting there with afternoon light streaming through the windows, and this extraordinary woman looking at him with open invitation to genuine connection, Edmund found that it troubled him not at all. "No," he said, quietly. "It does not trouble me, Catherine." Her smile transformed her entire face. "Good. Then perhaps you might tell me what it is that makes you so determined to keep the world at arm's length." Edmund had not intended to tell her, had not planned to reveal anything beyond the most superficial biographical details, but something in her directness, her own evident courage in offering vulnerability first, loosened the constraints he typically maintained. "There was someone," he began slowly. 7 years ago. Her name was Elizabeth. We were engaged to be married." Catherine said nothing, simply watched him with steady attention. "I believed—" Edmund stopped, corrected himself. "No, I did not merely believe. I knew that we loved one another, or I thought I knew. She was beautiful, charming, everything society claimed a gentleman should desire in a wife." He paused, the old anger stirring. "And 3 weeks before our wedding, I discovered her in my own gardens with another man, locked in an embrace that left no room for misinterpretation. I am sorry. It was not the betrayal itself that destroyed something in me, though that was certainly painful. It was what she said afterward." Edmund found himself unable to look at Catherine as he continued. "She laughed, actually laughed when I confronted her, and she told me that she had never loved me, that I was impossibly dull, that she had only accepted my proposal because a viscountcy was respectable, even if the man holding it was tedious beyond endurance." "She was cruel," Catherine said quietly. "And wrong." "Was she? I am serious. I do treat things as matters of grave importance. I do not possess the easy charm that makes social interaction effortless. I am—" he gestured helplessly, "precisely as she described." "You are thoughtful," Catherine corrected with sudden fierceness. "You are intelligent and principled and honest. You treat ideas with respect rather than dismissing them as fashionable amusements. You read Greek historians not to appear cultured, but because you genuinely care about understanding human nature. These are not flaws, Edmund. These are the qualities that make you remarkable." Edmund looked at her finally, saw something in her eyes that made breathing difficult. "You barely know me." "I know you better than you think. I know you well enough to recognize that you have spent 7 years punishing yourself for someone else's failure to appreciate what you offered. I know you well, enough to see that you are terrified of offering it again, because betrayal taught you that vulnerability equals devastation." The words were too accurate, too exposing. Edmund felt his defenses rising instinctively, felt the old protective anger stirring. "You think you understand me based on a handful of conversations and a shared afternoon in a library? I think I understand what it means to be judged inadequate by people whose judgment reveals more about their own limitations than yours." "It is not the same, is it not?" Catherine's voice remained calm but carried steel beneath the gentleness. "You were told you were too serious, too earnest, too boring. I have been told I am too intelligent, too direct, too unorthodox. We have both been informed that our authentic selves are somehow insufficient. The only difference is that I have chosen to reject that judgment, while you have chosen to accept it as truth." Edmund stood abruptly, moving toward the windows with sudden need for distance. "You know nothing of what you speak. Then correct me." She had not moved from her chair, but her voice followed him across the room. "Tell me I am wrong. Tell me you have not spent 7 years holding everyone at distance, because one shallow woman proved incapable of recognizing your worth. Tell me you are not standing here right now, drawn to connection despite yourself, while simultaneously preparing to reject it because vulnerability terrifies you more than loneliness does. He spun to face her, anger and fear and something else, something desperate and longing warring in his chest. You want honesty, Catherine. Very well. You are right. All of it. I am terrified. I am standing here experiencing feelings I swore never to allow again, and every instinct I possess is screaming at me to leave, to retreat to safety, to maintain the distance that keeps me from being devastated again. But you are still here. Yes, he admitted roughly. God help me. I am still here. Catherine rose finally, moved toward him with careful deliberation. She stopped at a distance that was still proper but somehow felt intimate in the quiet library. Then perhaps the question is not whether you feel drawn to connection, but whether you possess the courage to risk it anyway. And if I do not possess such courage, then you will spend the rest of your life protected but profoundly alone, which is certainly safe, Edmund, but I am not convinced it is actually what you want. She was too close now, close enough that he could see the exact pattern of those gold flecks in her green eyes, close enough to catch her subtle perfume, close enough that reaching out would require only the smallest movement. The greatest risk we ever take is not in loving and losing, but in refusing to love at all out of fear that we might lose. Because the walls we build to protect ourselves from pain ultimately imprison us in isolation more complete than any betrayal could achieve. And Edmund, standing in that library with Catherine Ashworth looking at him with challenge and invitation and hope, made the only choice his damaged heart would allow. He stepped back. "I apologize, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice carefully emptied of emotion. "I have been presumptuous. I should not have burdened you with personal history that is no concern of yours, and I certainly should not have allowed inappropriate familiarity in our address. I believe it would be best if I took my leave." He watched her expression close, saw hope fade into careful neutrality, but there was something else in her eyes now. Disappointment, yes, but also a glimmer of what might have been anger. "Of course, Lord Thorne," she said, her voice as carefully neutral as his own. "Forgive me for overstepping." "There is nothing to forgive. The fault is mine entirely." He bowed. She curtsied. They observed all the proper formalities. And then Edmund walked out of the library, down the stairs, out into the bath. Afternoon with its autumn light and falling leaves. He told himself he had made the right choice, the safe choice, the only choice that protected both of them from inevitable disappointment. He told himself this repeatedly as he walked back to his lodgings, through streets that seemed suddenly grey despite the golden afternoon light. He told himself this as he sat alone in his rooms, staring at his unopened Thucydides, remembering the way Catherine had looked at him with understanding and challenge and hope, and he almost believed it. The rain began on Friday morning and continued with relentless determination through the following week. Bath transformed under its persistent assault, the honeyed stone darkening to amber, the streets running with water, the assembly rooms and pump rooms filling with trapped visitors who had come seeking health and found only weather. Edmund remained in his lodgings. This was sensible, he told himself. The rain made walking unpleasant. The social spaces would be overcrowded with people seeking distraction from confinement, and he had correspondence to attend to. Letters from his steward at Thornfield, matters of estate business that required attention, the endless administrative details that came with a viscountcy. He answered these letters with his usual precision, managed his affairs with customary efficiency, and told himself repeatedly that he was not avoiding anything. He was simply being practical. Robert saw through this. Immediately. "You have not left these rooms in 6 days," his cousin observed, having arrived uninvited on Wednesday afternoon with wine and determination. "You are beginning to resemble a Gothic hermit." "I am attending to business." "You are hiding." Robert settled into a chair without waiting for invitation. "And we both know precisely what, or rather whom, you are hiding from." Edmund looked up from the letter he was attempting to write, his expression carefully arranged into aristocratic. "Frost, I am not hiding from anyone. I simply see no reason to venture out in this appalling weather when I have matters requiring attention here. The weather is no worse than any English autumn, and your matters could be attended to by your perfectly capable steward, as they have been for years." Robert leaned forward, his usually cheerful expression serious. "Talk to me, Edmund. What happened?" "Nothing happened." "Something clearly happened. Last week you were finally emerging from your self-imposed exile. You had actually smiled on at least one occasion, and you attended the assembly despite claiming to despise such events. This week you have retreated so completely that I half expect to find you have started writing dark poetry and contemplating the void." Despite himself, Edmund felt his lips twitch. "That is absurd." "Is it? Because I am beginning to worry that I will arrive one morning to find you have renounced society entirely and taken up residence in some remote Scottish castle where you can brood dramatically while staring at storms." "I do not brood." "You absolutely brood. You have elevated brooding to an art form." Robert's expression softened. "What did she say to you?" Edmund set down his pen with deliberate care. "She said nothing that was not perfectly reasonable." "Then why are you hiding from her?" "I am not—" Edmund stopped, forced himself toward honesty. "She asked me to be vulnerable, to risk connection despite past pain, and I refused." "Ah." Robert was quiet for a long moment. "And now you are ashamed of that refusal." "I am not ashamed. I made the rational choice, the self-preserving choice, the cowardly choice." Edmund felt anger flash through him, sharp and defensive. "I am not a coward." "Are you not? You are hiding in your rooms rather than face a woman who offered you exactly what you claim to want, genuine connection with someone who might actually understand you. That seems rather cowardly to me." "You do not understand." "I understand perfectly well." Robert's voice was gentle now, which somehow made the words more devastating. "You are terrified that if you allow yourself to care for her, she will prove to be Elizabeth all over again. You are convinced that your authentic self is insufficient, that you are too serious or too boring or too whatever Elizabeth accused you of being, and so you are choosing loneliness over the risk of being disappointed again. That is not—" "Edmund," Robert interrupted firmly. "I have known you my entire life. I knew you before Elizabeth, and I have watched what you have become after her, and I am telling you, as someone who loves you, that you are allowing one cruel woman's judgment to dictate the rest of your existence." Edmund looked away, unable to meet his cousin's eyes. "What if she is right? What if I am exactly as Elizabeth described, dull, tedious, impossibly serious? Then Miss Ashworth is a fool for seeming to enjoy your company, as are the dozens of people who hold you in genuine regard, despite your best efforts to keep them at distance." Robert paused. "But I do not think Elizabeth was right. I think she was shallow and unkind, and I think she revealed her own inadequacy rather than yours." Catherine said something similar. "Miss Ashworth is clearly a woman of excellent judgment, which is why you should stop hiding and speak with her." Edmund was quiet for a long time, listening to rain against the windows, feeling the weight of 7 years pressing down on him. "What if I cannot? What if I have spent so long protecting myself that I no longer remember how to do anything else?" "Then you practice," Robert said simply. "You start with small acts of courage and build from there. You allow yourself to be uncomfortable and vulnerable and afraid, and you do it anyway because the alternative is spending the rest of your life safe and miserable." After Robert left, Edmund sat alone in the gathering dusk, staring at nothing. His cousin's words echoed in the quiet room, mixing with Catherine's voice from the library. Whether you possess the courage to risk it anyway. He had told himself he was being sensible, protective, rational, but sitting there in the grey light with rain falling endlessly outside, Edmund was forced to acknowledge a different truth. He had been a coward, not because he feared caring for Catherine, but because he feared she might care for him in return, and then discover, as Elizabeth had, that what he offered was insufficient. It was easier to reject first, safer to maintain distance than risk intimacy, more comfortable to remain behind his carefully constructed walls than venture out into the vulnerable space where real connection occurred. But comfortable was not the same as content, and safe was very far from happy. Edmund rose finally, moved to the window, watched rain transform Bath into something watercolor and indistinct. Somewhere out there, Catherine was going about her life, reading her philosophy, walking alone when weather permitted, maintaining her brave refusal to soften herself into something more acceptable. And he was here, hiding from the very connection he had spent 7 years longing for. The realization settled over him with devastating clarity. He had become precisely what he feared. Not boring or tedious or too serious, but small, limited, reduced by fear into something less than he might have been. Elizabeth had taken his heart and broken it carelessly, but he had taken the pieces and built a prison from them, and he had been living in that prison ever since, telling himself it was protection, when in truth it was simply another form of devastation. He could remain there. He could stay safe and separate and slowly calcify into the Gothic hermit Robert had accused him of becoming. Or he could find whatever scraps of courage remained and attempt to be more than fear had made him. The choice should have been simple. But Edmund, standing in his darkening rooms with rain falling outside, discovered that 7 years of careful self-protection could not be dismantled in a single moment of recognition. Fear had roots that went deep, and pulling them up required more than simple acknowledgement of their existence. So he did not go to her that evening, or the next day. He remained in his rooms, attending to his correspondence, reading his Greek historians, telling himself he was preparing, gathering his courage, waiting for the right moment, and telling himself he was not, in fact, simply postponing inevitable confrontation with his own cowardice. The rain continued. Bath grew grey and sodden, and Edmund remained alone with his books and his carefully maintained distance, and the growing recognition that safety had become its own form of suffering. It was Robert who finally forced the issue, arriving unexpectedly on Sunday morning with news delivered in tones of barely suppressed concern. "She is leaving," he said without preamble. Edmund looked up from his breakfast, toast and coffee, neither of which he had been successfully eating. "Who is leaving?" "Miss Ashworth. She and her aunt are departing Bath tomorrow morning. Apparently Mrs. Daventry has received word of some family matter requiring their presence in London." The words landed like physical blows. Edmund felt something cave in his chest, felt air leave his lungs in a rush that might have been panic. "Tomorrow?" "Yes, tomorrow. Morning early. They have already begun packing." Edmund stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with harsh sound. "I must. That is—" "Yes," Robert agreed. "You must." He was out the door before conscious decision, barely stopping to collect his coat, running through Sunday morning Bath with rain starting again, running because walking seemed impossible, and time had acquired sudden, terrible weight. He reached her lodgings breathless and soaked, presented himself to the servant who, answered with less dignity than a viscount should properly display, was shown to a sitting room, where he waited with heart-pounding while the servant went to announce him. Catherine appeared after several minutes that felt like hours. She wore a simple morning dress, her hair loosely arranged as though she had been interrupted in the middle of preparations. Her expression, when she saw him standing dripping on her aunt's carpet, was carefully neutral. "Lord Thorne," she said with perfect politeness. "This is an unexpected visit." Edmund found himself suddenly uncertain of everything, his purpose, his words, his right to be here at all. "I heard that you are leaving." "Yes, tomorrow morning. My aunt has received word of her sister's illness. We are needed in London." "I see." He did not see, could barely think past the panic rising in his chest. "Might I— that is, could we speak privately?" Catherine regarded him for a long moment, something complex moving behind her eyes. Then she nodded. "The morning room is empty. We may speak there, provided we leave the door open for propriety." She led him down a short corridor to a small room overlooking a garden, gone brown with autumn. Rain streaked the windows, turning the view impressionistic and grey. They stood facing one another with several feet of space between them, and Edmund found he had absolutely no idea what to say. "Why are you here, Edmund?" The question was delivered without heat, simple curiosity mixed with evident wariness, and the use of his given name struck him with unexpected force, reminder of what he had rejected in the library, what he had walked away from out of fear. "I came to apologize," he began. "For what?" "You were perfectly honest in the library. You do not wish to risk vulnerability, that is your choice to make." "It was not honesty. It was cowardice." "Perhaps." She moved to the window, looked out at the rain-soaked garden. But it was still your choice. Edmund felt something desperate rising in his chest. Catherine, No. She turned to face him, and there was steel in her voice now beneath the careful neutrality. You do not get to leave me standing in that library, dismissed and humiliated, and then arrive days later expecting what precisely? That I have been pining for you? That I am grateful you have finally decided I might be worth the risk after all? That is not. I offered you honesty. I offered you myself, exactly as I am, without pretense or performance. And you rejected that offer because you are so convinced of your own inadequacy that you cannot imagine anyone might genuinely want what you have to offer. Her eyes blazed with anger he had not seen before. Well, I am tired of trying to convince people that I am acceptable as I am, and I am certainly not interested in convincing you that you are acceptable as you are, only to have you decide once again that safety is more important than connection. The words struck with devastating accuracy. Edmund felt them landing in his chest like arrows, each one finding its mark. You are right, he said quietly. I know I am right. She stopped. What? You are right. About all of it. I am convinced of my inadequacy. I did reject you because I was terrified, and I have spent days hiding in my rooms telling myself I was being sensible, when in truth I was simply being a coward. He moved closer, not touching but closing the distance. But I am here now, inadequate and terrified and soaking. Your carpet, but here. Catherine stared at him, her anger visibly warring with something else. Why? Why now, after a week of silence? Because you are leaving tomorrow, and I cannot bear the thought of you leaving while believing that what you offered was not precious to me. Because I spent 7 years protecting myself from pain, and in the process I protected myself from everything else as well. Because I am tired, Catherine. I am tired of being safe and separate and alone. So you want, what? For me to stay? To wait while you sort through your fears? No, Edmund said. I want you to know that you were right. That I do want connection despite my fear. That you are remarkable and brave and everything I did not know I was seeking. And that I am sorry, profoundly sorry, for being too much of a coward to tell you this when it mattered. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those remarkable eyes. Then, very quietly, she said, But you are still afraid. Yes. And that fear has not magically disappeared simply because I am leaving tomorrow. No. Then what has changed? Edmund took a breath, felt something settle in his chest that might have been certainty. What has changed is that I have finally recognized that the fear of losing you is greater than the fear of being hurt by you. The words hung between them in the grey morning light. Catherine's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Edmund to catalogue. Surprise, skepticism, hope, wariness. That is quite a dramatic declaration for a man who walked out of a library rather than risk vulnerability. Yes, Edmund agreed. It is, and I cannot promise that I will not be difficult. I cannot promise that 7 years of careful self-protection will simply vanish because I have acknowledged it as inadequate. I cannot promise that I will always be brave or open or any of the things you deserve. Then what can you promise? I can promise to try. I can promise that my cowardice in the library has taught me something essential about the difference between safety and happiness, and I can promise that if you are willing to give me another chance, even knowing that I am flawed and afraid and quite possibly too damaged for real connection, I will spend every day attempting to deserve that chance. Catherine moved to the window again, stared out at the rain-soaked garden as though it might hold answers. Edmund waited, barely breathing, feeling his entire future, balanced on whatever she might say next. Finally, she turned back to him. I am still leaving tomorrow. I know. And I do not know when or if I will return to Bath. I know. So, even if I were inclined to give you another chance, which I am not yet certain I am, we would be separated by considerable distance with no guarantee of future connection. Yes. Edmund felt something break inside his chest. He had come too late, offered too little, damaged what might have been beyond any possibility of repair. But then Catherine smiled, not the careful social smile, but the genuine one that transformed her face, and said, You said something in the library that I have been thinking about a great deal this past week. What did I say? You said, "God help me, I am still here." You were speaking about your fear of connection, about your inability to leave despite every instinct screaming at you to retreat. She moved closer, near enough now that he could see the exact pattern of gold in her green eyes. And I found myself thinking, that is all anyone can really offer. Not perfection, not the absence of fear, but the simple courage to still be here despite everything that makes them want to leave. Catherine, I am still leaving tomorrow, she continued. But perhaps if you can find the courage to still be here when I return, whenever that might be, then we might discover whether your fear and my caution can somehow make space for something more. It was not a declaration, not a promise, barely even an agreement, but it was possibility. And possibility was more than Edmund had dared hope for. I will be here, he said with sudden certainty. Whenever you return, however long it takes, I will be here. Good. She extended her hand and Edmund took it, feeling the contact like electricity through his entire body. Then perhaps we might begin again when next we meet, with less pretense and more honesty. I would like that very much. They stood there, hands clasped, while rain fell against the windows and time seemed suspended in the grey morning light, and Edmund felt something shift inside his chest, felt the calcification of 7 years beginning, just beginning, to crack. It was not healing, not yet, but it was the possibility of healing, and that was more than he had allowed himself in longer than he cared to remember. Catherine withdrew her hand finally, the loss of contact acute. You should go. My aunt will be wondering what has kept me. Yes, but Edmund found himself hesitating. Catherine, thank you for giving me another chance when I did not particularly deserve one. We all deserve chances to become better than fear has made us, she replied softly. The question is whether we possess the courage to take them. Edmund left her lodgings and walked back through Bath's rain-washed streets, feeling lighter than he had in years. The fear had not vanished. If anything, it burned stronger now that he had something precious to lose. But alongside the fear ran something else, hope. The fragile, dangerous hope that perhaps he might be capable of more than safety and separation. That evening he sat in his rooms and wrote, not correspondence about estate matters, but something more personal. He wrote about Greek historians and library afternoons, and the courage required to risk vulnerability. He wrote about fear and cowardice, and the difference between protection and prison. He wrote because sometimes words came more easily than speech, and because he wanted Catherine to have something tangible when next they met. He did not know when that would be, did not know if days or weeks or months would pass before she returned to Bath, but he found, somewhat to his surprise, that the uncertainty did not terrify him as it might once have done, because he had made a promise, and Edmund Thorne, for all his flaws and fears and careful self-protection, had never broken a promise in his life. He would be here when she returned, and perhaps if he could maintain that simple courage, they might discover what lay beyond fear on the other side of honesty. Winter settled over Bath with crystalline precision. Snow fell in early December, transforming the city into something from a painting, all white rooftops and grey skies, and the warm glow of windows against gathering dusk. The assembly rooms held their Christmas ball, the pump room filled with visitors seeking seasonal diversion alongside their therapeutic waters. Life continued with its usual rhythms, and Edmund moved through it with the discipline that had always characterized his existence. But something fundamental had shifted. He did not hide anymore. He attended the assembly balls, accepted invitations to private gatherings, even agreed to join a small group that met weekly to discuss philosophy and politics in one of Bath's coffeehouses. He was not gregarious, would never be gregarious, but neither was he the Gothic hermit Robert had accused him of becoming. He read his Greek historians, but now he thought of Catherine while he read, imagined what she might say about Thucydides' pragmatism or Herodotus's storytelling. He walked through Bath's streets and noticed details he had previously ignored, the way light fell across the circus at certain hours, the particular quality of silence in the library on Tuesday afternoons, the way ordinary people moved through their ordinary lives with small graces and quiet dignity. He was, quite, without intending it, learning to see the world as Catherine saw it, with appreciation for reality rather than disappointment at its failure to match some impossible ideal. The writing helped. The pages he had begun that rainy November evening had grown into something more substantial, part journal, part philosophical reflection, part attempt to articulate truths about fear and courage and the various ways people learn to protect themselves from pain. He did not know if he would ever show it to anyone, but the act of writing it seemed essential nonetheless, a way of making sense of what he had been and what he hoped to become. Christmas came and went. Edmund spent it with Robert and his family, endured his cousin's knowing looks and careful questions about whether he had heard from a certain lady in London, and returned to his lodgings feeling the peculiar mixture of loneliness and contentment that characterized his new existence. January arrived with bitter cold and clear skies, and then on the morning of January 17th, Edmund received a brief note delivered to his lodgings. "I have returned to Bath. If you are still here, as you promised, I will be in the library Thursday afternoon. C." Edmund read the note 3 times, feeling his heart accelerate with each reading. She was back. After 2 months of silence punctuated only by one formal letter about her aunt's sister, who had recovered, thankfully, Catherine had returned, and she wanted to see him. Thursday seemed, impossibly distant. Edmund filled the intervening days with activity designed to prevent him from dwelling on every possible outcome of their meeting. He walked extensively, exhausting himself with physical exertion. He read without absorbing a single word. He attempted to write, but found himself staring at blank pages, all his carefully articulated thoughts having fled in the face of impending consequence. Robert found him Wednesday evening, pacing his rooms with barely contained anxiety. "You are going to wear a path in that carpet." Edmund stopped pacing, ran a hand through his hair. "I do not know what to say to her. Start with hello. The rest generally follows from there. What if she has changed her mind? What if these 2 months have given her time to reconsider, and she has decided, sensibly, that I am too much trouble? Then she would not have sent you that note." Robert settled into a chair, regarding his cousin with affectionate exasperation. "Edmund, I have watched you. Spend 2 months becoming someone slightly less terrible at being human. She will see that change. Trust that she will see it. And if the change is insufficient, then you will survive it, as you have survived everything else. But I do not think it will be insufficient." Robert's expression softened. "You are still afraid. That is natural. But you are here despite the fear. That is what matters." The next afternoon, Edmund arrived at the library 30 minutes early. Unable to wait any longer, he carried his volume of Thucydides like a talisman, settled into his accustomed chair, and attempted to read while his entire body remained tensed with anticipation. She arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. Edmund heard her footsteps on the library stairs, heard the door open, felt his heart leap painfully against his ribs. He forced himself to remain seated, to let her approach, to not reveal the intensity of emotion churning through his chest. Catherine paused in the doorway, and Edmund felt everything stop. She wore deep burgundy today, her hair arranged with a simple elegance he remembered, but there was something different in her face, a wariness that had not been present before, a carefulness around her eyes that suggested these 2 months had not been easy for her either. "Lord Thorne," she said quietly, "you are still here." Edmund rose, because remaining seated seemed impossible. "I promised I would be." "Yes." She moved into the room, though she did not immediately approach his chair. "You did." They stood there, the familiar library surrounding them with afternoon light and the scent of old books, and Edmund felt the weight of 2 months pressing down on the moment. "How was London?" he asked finally, because silence had become unbearable. "Cold, crowded, full of obligations I had forgotten existed." A ghost of a smile. "I found myself missing Bath, which surprised me, as I spent most of my time here complaining about Bath's insufficiencies." "Perhaps you were not missing Bath so much as missing—" Edmund stopped, courage failing him. "Missing what?" Catherine prompted gently. "Missing what we found here," he finished. "In this library, on Thursday afternoons." "Yes." She moved closer now, near enough that Edmund could see her eyes properly. Still that remarkable green, still flecked with gold. "I was missing that. I was missing conversations that mattered, and someone who saw me rather than the version of me society wished I would become." She paused. "Were you missing it as well?" "Every day," Edmund admitted. Every single day since you left. But you are still afraid. It was not a question, but Edmund answered anyway. Yes, terrified, if I am being honest, but I have learned something these past 2 months. What have you learned? That fear is not actually preventative. I can be afraid and still be here. I can be terrified and still want this, want you, more than I want safety. He took a breath, forced himself toward complete honesty. I have also learned that I am capable of change, not dramatic transformation. I will never be charming or easy in society, but I can be more than I was. I can be present rather than merely protected. Catherine studied him for a long moment, her expression revealing nothing. Then she moved to her accustomed chair, settled into it with familiar grace, and produced the lock volume Edmund remembered from November. Then perhaps, she said, opening the book to a marked page, we might begin again, with honesty rather than pretense, with acknowledgement of fear rather than pretending it does not exist. Edmund felt something ease in his chest. He returned to his own chair, opened his Thucydides, and discovered that he could actually focus on the words now that she was here, real and present, and willing to offer him another chance. They read in companionable silence for perhaps 30 minutes. Edmund found himself glancing up occasionally to watch Catherine as she read. The way she frowned slightly when encountering a difficult passage, the way she occasionally made notes in her journal, the way afternoon light caught in her dark hair, and caught her watching him in return. You are staring, she observed, not looking up from her book. I am appreciating. Is there a difference? I think perhaps there is. Staring is observation without connection. Appreciation is, he searched for the right words, acknowledgement that what one observes has value beyond its mere existence. She looked up then, meeting his gaze directly. That is a rather philosophical distinction for a man reading military history. I have been thinking philosophically lately. You seem to have had that effect on me. Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile. I warned you I was dangerously unorthodox. So you did, though I confess I did not understand the full danger until it was too late. And are you sorry, now that you understand the danger? Edmund set down his book, leaned forward with sudden intensity. I am sorry for many things, Catherine. I am sorry I walked out of this library in November. I am sorry I wasted a week hiding in my rooms rather than fighting for what I wanted. I am sorry I was too much of a coward to tell you immediately that you were remarkable and brave and everything I had been too afraid to hope for. But, she prompted, clearly hearing the unspoken qualification, but I am not sorry that you forced me to confront my fear. I am not sorry that you refused to accept the performance I had been giving for 7 years, and I am not sorry, will never be sorry, for meeting you, even if this ends badly, even if I prove insufficient, even if every fear I possess turns out to be justified. The deepest courage we can show is not the absence of fear, but the choice to love anyway, to offer ourselves honestly despite knowing we might be hurt, to risk connection despite past betrayals, to believe that the possibility of joy outweighs the certainty of safety. Catherine was quiet for a long time. Edmund could see emotions moving across her face, hope warring with caution, desire competing with self-protection. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. I was hurt when you walked away, more than I wanted to admit even to myself, because I had offered you honesty, and you had rejected it, rejected me, because you were so convinced of your own inadequacy that you could not imagine I might genuinely want you. I know, and I am sorry to— Let me finish. She held up a hand. I was hurt, but these 2 months in London gave me time to think, and I realized something important. I was asking you to be vulnerable while maintaining my own careful distance. I was demanding courage while protecting myself from the consequences of offering it. That is not— It is. I told myself I was being forthright and direct, that I was offering honest connection, but I was also holding back, testing you, to see if you would prove worthy before I risked anything genuine myself. That was unfair, and it was cowardly in its own way. Edmund felt something shift in his understanding. So, we were both afraid. Yes, we were both afraid. The difference was that I had convinced myself my fear was actually strength. while you at least acknowledged yours as weakness." She smiled then, the genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "Perhaps we might try again, both of us, with full acknowledgement that we are frayed and flawed and quite possibly going to handle this badly at multiple points." "I would like that," Edmund said quietly. "I would like that very much." "Good." Catherine set aside her lock, leaned forward in her chair. "Then perhaps you might tell me what you have been doing these past 2 months. And I do not mean estate business or social obligations. I mean what you have actually been doing." So Edmund told her about the philosophy group he had joined, about the walks through winter, Bath, about learning to see the world with appreciation rather than judgment, about the pages he had written, trying to articulate truths about fear and courage and the various ways people learn to protect themselves from pain. "Might I read what you have written?" Catherine asked when he had finished. Edmund felt vulnerability wash through him. "It is not particularly good, and it is intensely personal, which is precisely why I wish to read it, if you are willing to share it." He was not willing. The pages represented thoughts he had barely acknowledged to himself, let alone prepared to share with anyone else. But he found himself nodding anyway, because this was what vulnerability required, the offering of things that felt too precious, too fragile, too revealing. "I will bring them next week," he said, "though I warn you they are likely to be quite boring." "Edmund," Catherine's voice carried gentle reproof, "stop anticipating rejection. You do not know what I will think until I've actually read them." "You are right. Old habits. Very old habits. We will have to work on breaking them." She paused, then added with careful casualness, "Mr. Whitmore called on me yesterday." Edmund felt his entire body tense. "Did he?" "Yes. He had heard I was back in Bath and came to renew his acquaintance." She was watching Edmund's face carefully. "He invited me to the assembly this evening." "And will you go?" Edmund forced the words out, past the tightness in his throat. "I told him I had a prior commitment." "Do you have a prior commitment?" Catherine tilted her head, studying him with those remarkable eyes. "That depends. Are you planning to invite me to the assembly this evening?" Edmund felt his heart begin to race. "Would you accept if I did?" "I might, provided the invitation was genuine rather than an attempt to prevent Mr. Whitmore from escorting me." "It would be genuine, entirely genuine. I find that I—" He stopped, forced himself toward complete honesty. "I find that I want very much to spend the evening in your company. Dancing would simply be an excuse to hold you without violating propriety." Her smile blazed across her face. "That is quite possibly the most honest thing you have ever said to me." "Then you will come?" "Yes, Edmund, I will come." The assembly that evening was crowded with Bath's winter visitors, the ballroom warm despite the bitter cold outside, the air filled with music and conversation and the perpetual performance of society. Edmund moved through it with Catherine on his arm, and for the first time in 7 years, he did not feel like an outsider watching a theatre he despised. They danced 3 times, once more than strict propriety permitted, but Edmund found he did not care. Each dance was an opportunity to hold her, to speak quietly beneath the music, to feel the connection between them growing stronger with each shared moment. During the second waltz, Edmund found courage he had not known he possessed. "I am falling in love with you," he said quietly, the words escaping before he could prevent them. "I thought you should know, even though it terrifies me, even though I am quite possibly doing this badly, even though—" "Edmund." Catherine stopped him with the simple expedient of stepping marginally closer than the waltz strictly required. "Stop cataloguing all the reasons you might be insufficient and simply let yourself feel what you are feeling." "But what if—" "No." She was smiling now, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been joy. "No more what-ifs, not tonight. Tonight we simply dance, and you simply feel, and we both simply acknowledge that this is terrifying and wonderful and worth every moment of fear." So Edmund did exactly that. He let himself feel the warmth of her hand in his, the subtle pressure of her waist beneath his palm, the way she looked at him with understanding and challenge, and something that might actually be love. He let himself be present rather than protected, vulnerable rather than defended, and discovered that vulnerability, while terrifying, was also oddly exhilarating. The evening progressed. Edmund introduced Catherine to Robert, who immediately charmed her with stories of Edmund's childhood misadventures. They spoke with several other acquaintances, Edmund finding to his surprise that social interaction was considerably easier with Catherine beside him. She had a gift for drawing people out, for finding the interesting thread in even mundane conversation, for making everyone she spoke with feel genuinely seen. It was well past midnight when Edmund finally escorted her back to her lodgings, through streets gone quiet and cold. Snow had begun falling again, transforming Bath into something magical and still. They paused at her door, neither quite ready to separate. "Thank you," Catherine said softly, "for inviting me, and for being honest about your feelings, even though it clearly terrified you. Thank you for accepting, and for not laughing when I stammered through what was quite possibly the least romantic declaration of developing affection in the history of courtship." She laughed then, a genuine, delighted sound that made Edmund's heart lift. "I rather liked it. It was honest. And honesty, I think, is rather more valuable than romance. Nevertheless, I should like to try again." Edmund took her hand, held it gently in both of his. "Catherine, I am falling in love with you. I have been falling since the moment I saw you in the pump room, looking at Bath with frank assessment, and refusing to pretend enthusiasm you did not feel. I have been falling in love with your intelligence and your courage, and your remarkable refusal to soften yourself into something more acceptable to society's expectations. Edmund, I am not finished. I need you to know that I am aware of my limitations. I am serious and earnest, and will likely always be somewhat terrible at the performative aspects of society. I have fears that will probably take years to fully overcome. I am damaged in ways that may never completely heal." "We are all damaged," Catherine said gently. "That is simply what it means to have lived." "Perhaps, but I want you to know what you would be accepting if you—" He stopped, courage faltering. "If I what?" she prompted. "If you decided you might be falling in love with me as well." Catherine smiled then, the genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "I already have decided. I have been falling in love with you since you stood in that library, looking simultaneously terrified and determined, unable to leave, despite every instinct screaming at you to retreat. I have been falling in love with your honesty and your struggle and your remarkable courage in continuing to show up despite being afraid." Edmund felt something break open in his chest. Not painful this time, but joyful. The calcification of 7 years cracking completely, allowing light and warmth and hope to flood through. "So we are both falling," he said wonderingly. "Yes, we are both falling, and perhaps that is enough, to fall together, with full acknowledgement that we might fail, but with commitment to try anyway." Edmund pulled her close then, not kissing her, that would have been inappropriate on a public street, but simply holding her, feeling her warmth against him, breathing in her subtle perfume, allowing himself to fully experience the reality of connection he had spent 7 years avoiding. "I love you," he said into her hair, "not falling anymore. Simply, completely, terrifyingly love you." "I love you as well," she replied, "despite all your fears and careful self-protection and tendency to overthink everything, perhaps even because of those things." They stood there in the falling snow, holding one another while Bath slept around them, and Edmund felt, for the first time in 7 years, something approaching wholeness. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Edmund and Catherine met regularly. In the library on Thursday afternoons, walking along the river when weather permitted, attending assemblies and concerts and all the various social events that Bath offered. They spoke of philosophy and Greek historians and the various ways people learned to navigate their fears. They argued occasionally. Both were strong-willed and intelligent, and disagreements were inevitable. But they argued honestly, without the defensive cruelty that characterized so many society disputes. Edmund showed her his pages, the philosophical reflections he had been writing. Catherine read them carefully, made notes in margins, engaged with his ideas with the same serious attention she brought to Locke and Herodotus. And she shared her own writing, journals she had kept since her father's death, reflections on loss and loneliness, and the courage required to remain authentic in a world that constantly demanded performance. They learned another's patterns and preferences, discovered both compatibilities and differences, built gradually towards something that might sustain beyond Bath's temporary society. And then, on a March evening when spring was beginning to touch the air with warmth, Edmund took her walking along the river and asked her to marry him. He did not make a grand gesture, did not arrange musicians or elaborate staging, simply stopped on a quiet stretch of path, took both her hands in his, and said, "Catherine, I would like to spend the rest of my life experiencing Thursday afternoons with you, reading philosophy and arguing about Greek historians and learning how to be less afraid together. Would you consider marrying me?" She laughed, the genuine, delighted laugh he had learned to treasure. "That is quite possibly the least traditional proposal I have ever heard. I am quite possibly the least traditional suitor you have ever had." "True." She stepped closer, still holding his hands. "Yes, Edmund. I would like to spend the rest of my life experiencing Thursday afternoons with you. I accept your quite possibly least traditional proposal with great joy." He kissed her then, properly, thoroughly, with all the pent-up emotion of months spent learning to be vulnerable. And Catherine kissed him back with equal intensity, both of them acknowledging in that moment the extraordinary courage it required to love completely, despite knowing that love made one profoundly vulnerable. They were married in June at the church in Thornfield, with Robert standing up with Edmund and Catherine's aunt, weeping happily throughout the ceremony. It was a small wedding. Neither of them wanted the elaborate society production that was typical of aristocratic marriages. Just family and a few close friends gathered to witness two people promising to navigate fear together. In his vows, Edmund promised to show up, to be present despite his fears, to offer honesty despite its difficulty, to choose vulnerability over safety whenever the choice arose. Catherine promised the same, acknowledging her own tendency toward self-protection, her own struggles with trust. And as they spoke their vows in that small church with summer light streaming through ancient windows, Edmund felt the last remnants of calcification crack and fall away. Not because marriage solved anything, fear and damage and difficulty would remain, but because he had finally learned the difference between protection and prison, between safety and happiness, between performing life and actually living it. 7 years earlier, Edmund had believed himself destroyed by betrayal, and perhaps he had been, in a sense. But standing beside Catherine, promising to build a life together despite fear, he recognized that destruction had also been a kind of liberation. Elizabeth's cruelty had shattered the illusions he had built about love and vulnerability and connection, and from those shattered illusions he had eventually managed to construct something more honest, more real, more difficult, more precious. They lived at Thornfield Hall, where Catherine transformed the library into something magnificent and filled the rooms with books and conversation and the occasional philosophical argument that lasted well into the evening. Edmund managed his estates with his usual precision, but found time now for the discussions and walks and quiet afternoons that made life worth living. They visited Bath each autumn, staying in lodgings, near the assembly rooms, spending Thursday afternoons in the library where their connection had begun. And each time they sat in those familiar chairs with afternoon light streaming through the windows, Edmund felt gratitude for the courage Catherine had shown in refusing to accept his performance, for the persistence that had finally broken through his defenses, for the love that had taught him that vulnerability, while terrifying, was infinitely preferable to safety, because that was the lesson finally. Not that fear could be conquered, it could not really, but that fear could be acknowledged and carried and ultimately transcended by the simple act of showing up anyway, by choosing connection despite past betrayals, by offering vulnerability despite knowing that vulnerability meant risk, by being, as Catherine had said that Thursday afternoon in November, still here despite everything that made one want to leave. And Edmund, who had spent 7 years learning to protect himself from pain, spent the rest of his life learning instead how to be present for joy. This story of Edmund and Catherine unfolds in the drawing rooms and libraries of 19th century Bath, but its truths belong to every era, including our own. Their journey from fear to connection, from self-protection to vulnerability, offers profound lessons about the human experience of love and courage. Edmund spent 7 years building walls around his heart, telling himself he was being sensible and self-protective. But those walls meant to keep pain out ultimately imprisoned him in isolation. We often do the same. After experiencing betrayal, rejection, or disappointment, we construct elaborate defenses. We tell ourselves we are being realistic, guarding ourselves against future hurt. But in protecting ourselves from pain, we also wall ourselves off from joy, connection, and authentic human experience. The lesson here is not that we should be naive or reckless with our hearts, but that we must distinguish between healthy boundaries and defensive prisons. Catherine understood something essential. Vulnerability is not weakness, but courage. When she offered Edmund honest connection in the library, she was not being foolish or naive. She was being brave. True vulnerability requires us to show our authentic selves to another person despite knowing we might be hurt, misunderstood, or rejected. It is far easier to maintain safe distance, to perform roles rather than risk genuine presence. But connection, real, meaningful connection, can only occur when both people are willing to be seen as they actually are, complete with fears, flaws, and uncertainties. Edmund's great error was allowing Elizabeth's cruelty to teach him that all vulnerability leads to betrayal. He learned a pattern from one experience and applied it universally, unable to recognize that Catherine was not Elizabeth, that this moment was not that moment, that the present need not be dictated by the past. We all carry wounds from previous relationships, romantic, familial, or otherwise. The challenge is learning to recognize when we are responding to old patterns rather than present reality, when our defensive reactions protect us from ghosts rather than actual threats. Edmund was comfortable in his isolation. He had established routines, maintained control, avoided the uncertainty that comes with genuine connection. But comfort is not the same as contentment, and safety is not the same as happiness. Many of us settle for lives that are comfortable but unfulfilling, that protect us from pain, but also prevent us from experiencing joy. The question we must ask ourselves is not, am I safe, but am I actually living? Not, am I avoiding pain, but am I allowing myself to experience the full range of human emotion, including both suffering and delight? Perhaps the most important lesson in Edmund and Catherine's story is the simple practice of showing up, of being present despite fear, of continuing to engage even when every instinct screams for retreat. Edmund's transformation did not occur in a single moment of dramatic revelation. It happened gradually, through the repeated choice to be present in Catherine's company, to attend Thursday afternoons in the library, to risk connection despite terror. This is how real change occurs in our lives as well, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small acts of courage, through the daily practice of choosing presence over protection. Both Edmund and Catherine learned that authentic connection requires radical honesty, not just with one another, but with themselves. Edmund had to acknowledge his fear, his damage, his tendency toward defensive retreat. Catherine had to acknowledge her own caution, her own self-protection disguised as strength. Only by first being honest about their own limitations could they offer genuine connection to one another. This applies to all our relationships. We cannot build authentic connection on foundations of pretense, performance, or carefully curated versions of ourselves. Real intimacy requires us to be known as we actually are, not as we wish to be perceived. What Catherine offered Edmund was not primarily romantic love, though love certainly developed between them. What she offered first was the gift of being truly seen, of having someone look past his title, his carefully maintained facade, his defensive walls, and recognize the authentic person beneath. This experience of being genuinely seen and still valued is profoundly transformative. It gives us permission to exist as we are, rather than as we believe we must be. In our own relationships, we can offer this same gift, looking past surface presentation to recognize and value the authentic person, creating space where others can risk being known. How might we apply these lessons to our own lives? First, by examining honestly where we have built protective walls that have become prisons. What fears born from past hurts are we allowing to dictate our present? Where are we choosing safety over authentic connection? Second, by practicing small acts of vulnerability, showing up, being present, offering honesty even when it feels risky. We need not transform overnight, as Edmund did not, but we can begin the practice of choosing presence over protection, one small, courageous act at a time. Third, by learning to distinguish between healthy boundaries and defensive isolation. Protection is sometimes necessary, but it should serve our well-being rather than simply insulating us from all risk. Fourth, by recognizing that being seen, truly seen, by another person is both terrifying and essential to human flourishing. We must create spaces, both for ourselves and others, where authentic presence is not only allowed but celebrated. Finally, by remembering that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. Edmund never stopped being afraid, but he learned to be afraid and still show up, to be terrified and still offer vulnerability, to recognize danger and choose connection anyway. This is the courage available to all of us, not fearlessness, but the willingness to love, to connect, to be fully human, despite knowing that doing so makes us vulnerable to pain. The story of Edmund and Catherine reminds us that we are all wounded in various ways, all carrying fears born from past disappointments, all tempted to protect ourselves through isolation. But it also reminds us that healing is possible, that connection can occur despite fear, that we can learn to be vulnerable again even after devastating betrayal. The question is not whether we will experience fear, we will inevitably, but whether we will allow that fear to write the rest of our story, or whether we will find the courage to write something new. The greatest risk we ever take is not in loving and losing, but in refusing to love at all out of fear that we might lose.